Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event presented in the American Inspiration Author Series. It's great to have you with us tonight in the land of history, exploring the work of historians worldwide through time, their influences and impact. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, and producer of the American Inspiration Author Series. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring Richard Cohen and his new book, Making History, The Storytellers Who Shaped the Past. We're fortunate today that Mr. Cohen will present to us in full with illustrations for 30 to 35 minutes before addressing questions. He'll start in a moment, but first, some background. You should know that we are in a Zoom webinar format, which means your microphone is muted and your video is off. We can't take your comments in the chat box, but do look there for relevant information and helpful links. We asked for your questions as you registered. Thank you for those. If you have additional queries, enter them into the Q&A at the base of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. A video of tonight's program is being made by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. The link will be emailed to you in the day ahead when it's available in the American Inspiration Video Archive. Of course, the real pleasure comes from reading Richard Cohen's celebrated book, Making History, which is available for purchase through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Making History has been heralded on both sides of the Atlantic by the press, but also by fellow writers in the history business, including Hilary Mantel and John Meacham. Douglas Brinkley in the Washington Post said it was engaging and wildly ambitious. Others have named it a brilliant achievement, illuminating, epic, and quotable, which it certainly is. And I agree heartily with the New Yorker review that it is supremely entertaining, which for me is almost as important as being educational. Again, use the code AMINST23 as you order if you would like a signed copy for yourself or as a gift. Now, turning to introductions, Richard Cohen is the author of the books By Sword, Chasing the Sun, and How to Write Like Tolstoy. A former publishing director in London, he has edited numerous award-winning books, including Pulitzer and Booker Prize winners. He's edited a total of 21 #1 bestsellers. He's written for newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, including the New York Times Book Review and the Wall Street Journal. Richard Cohen is a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature. He is a 3-time Olympic fencer and a UK National Scrabble Contest finalist. He also writes crossword puzzles for fun, which is very admirable. Richard, you are a man of many talents, and it's really wonderful to have you with us. So a hearty welcome to you. We are all intrigued by your work. We have a crowd of history lovers here, and thank you so much for your book. As you know, I started to read bits and pieces of it, and I was jumping all over the place in it, and I just had to go back and read start to finish. I really fell in love with it. So I thank you for being with us today, and over to you.
Well, Margaret, thank you very much for that introduction, and I hope I can do you all justice. I think we can have the first slide, please, Kathleen. There you are. That's to make you all at home. I was going to have that as the background, the backdrop to my talk, rather than my untidy, overbook-laden study here in New York. But Margaret said that people like to see people's private rooms. So that's just to make you feel at home with the society. As you probably all know, the motto of the society is the past is present, taken from the 2 statues that were built in 1935 by Robert Aitken, and that now stand in the front of and back of the National Archives building in Washington. And I feel it's a bit of a shame there isn't a statue for the past as well. rather than just present and future. My own introduction really to history was when I was 13 and in typical old style British tradition was sent away to a boarding school in the southwest of England near Bath, which was run by Benedictine monks. Despite having the most Jewish of names, I have an Irish Catholic mother. So that's how that happened. And from the age of 13 onwards, till I left the school at 18, I was taught medieval history. And I remember that my special paper was on the dissolution of the monasteries in 1936. And I learned that the author of the main book on that subject was a man who was professor of modern history at Cambridge called David Knowles. And his view on the dissolution of the monasteries is that the monks had it coming to them. And I then learnt that in his time, he'd been a monk at Downside. Next slide, please. You may wonder that that's not the title you saw on the first shot of the cover. It's because early on, we had a different title and had to change it because there's an oral archive in Chicago called The History Makers, but it can show you that we changed about the various images that we decided to put on the cover to show the range of what's in the book. But on this monk, he had tried to foment a rebellion against the ruling monks at Downside Abbey and had been sent packing. And he obviously, in writing his books about religious life in Britain from 800 to 1500, and particularly the history of the dissolution of the monasteries, he had an agenda. And to my kind of rather dim teenage mind, I realized that history really has two meanings. It's the past, but it's also the people who tell us about the past, so that the historian acts as the interpreter. He or she is the filter. And very often, if not always, that historian has an agenda, how they want to put their history across and what they're going to select. They may try to be objective, but even objectivity is an agenda. And try as they must, I'm reminded of Tom Stoppard and his wonderful play Night and Day, which is about really the ethics and the life of journalists. And at one point, two journalists are discussing their approach to reporting. And one of them says, well, you know, mine's an objective fact-gathering organization. I try to be objective. And his friend says, oh yeah, are you objective for or objective against? And each historian has to make his own decision on that. And the truth is that even if we admit that most historians do have their prejudices, some of the best histories have been highly prejudiced with a very obvious agenda. So if we go to the next slide, you may disagree with me about whether this is the best known historian of all time. It's Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall, the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which was published in 1776, the same year, of course, as the US Act of Independence. And he was, as you see in that caricature, remarkably ugly. And although he had various prejudices, which he put into the writing of his mammoth best-selling book, one of them came from the fact that he was so ugly, that he chose to write about, if you like, one of the most beauty-conscious civilizations in history, because he was himself just 4'8", ginger-haired, corpulent. He suffered from so many physical diseases, problems, whatever, that he was never in good health. He actually fell in love at the age of 21 with a Swiss girl when he was packed off by his father to study in Switzerland. And later in life, when she turned him down, or rather his father had said, you can't marry a foreigner, he fell down and proposed to a woman when he was in his 50s. and then had to be helped to his feet when the woman turned him down, such was his body. In fact, at one point, he went to Paris, where he attended a grand soiree of a woman called Madame de Hazard, who was blind at that time. And the people who were new to her evening soirees used to have to present their faces to her, and she would feel their face to get a sense of the person who was attending. And so Gibbon presented his face to her, but with his small little mouth and bulbous cheeks, she thought that he was actually presenting his bottom to her and was aghast, and the whole evening broke up in uproar. But he wasn't really a professional historian. If anything, he was an MP, and not that he had to do anything to become one. One of the points about my book is that most of the people who've given us our sense of history weren't what we would call professional historians, weren't professors at a university or in some other way, academics who professed history. And so my book has a chapter on the Bible, looking at it in terms of what quality as history does it have. It includes journalists, diarists, historical novelists. And it also includes someone who I think has given us more of a sense of history even than Gibbon. And if we look at the next slide, it's a dramatist. It's William Shakespeare. And if you look at his plays, there'll be arguments about how many he wrote, but 38, 39, whatever you settle for, over half of them either are histories or were called histories at the time. And most people during Shakespeare's lifetime got their history from religious plays, sermons, but above all, they got them from the theatre. It's amazing, none of Shakespeare's plays were actually set in London or even in his own time. Yet he was, above all, a propagandist. His plays are all apologies or arguments for the Tudor cause. And theatre in his day, as the historian Simon Sharma says, theatre became the country's new theology. 2,000 people a day, despite the plague, censorship, would go to the theatre. It costs 1p if you're just a member of the groundlings. If you're rather grander, it costs 4p. The main theatres in London would put on 5 different plays a week. So when we think of Richard III, obviously his most popular play, or Prince Hal, Henry V, if we think of the Roman plays, our images of Cleopatra, of Mark Antony, of Julius Caesar are really Shakespeare's. Just as in our own time, Hilary Mantel has given us a sense of Thomas Cromwell, which is now the way most people think of Thomas Cromwell, not the villain of, say, Robert Bolt's play, A Man for All Season, but the hero of Hilary Mantel's trilogy. And it's not just dramatists who've had such a huge effect on history. Next, please. That is Sir Walter Scott, who was born in 1814 and started fiction writing relatively late, when he was 31. He was a lawyer, a practicing barrister, and also a very well-known poet. But in 15 years, he wrote 25 novels, 7 short stories, and 5 plays, and was wildly popular. Byron, who rather displaced him as a poet, Scott really gave up writing poetry when Byron arrived, because he knew Byron was far better at it. But Byron said, "Ah, Scott, wonderful man. I long to get drunk with him." But the effect of Scott's writing historical novels, they were wildly unhistorical in many ways. I mean, things like the bagpipes, he's got the reputation of having invented. They're invented in ancient Egypt. All kinds of things which are taken to be part of the Scottish national character was Scott's invention. But the effect he had, not just on Scotland, obviously, because he was concerned that Scottish history should become known and beloved, and on England, his effect on the continent was extraordinary. Alessandro Manzoni wrote The Betrothed because of Scott. Pushkin wrote The Captain's Daughter. In Germany, Before the Storm. Spain wrote Benito Caldas wrote 46 historical novels. Then, of course, you go on to Tolstoy. These were all people who said, if Scott can become a best-selling author using history, we're going to do the same in our tongue for our nation. And when Victor Hugo was told by his publishers he had to write a Scott-like novel, that's when he sat down and wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So to the historical novelists, and to Scott in particular, we bow down to the kind of history telling that gives a degree of fact-telling, but has the imagination of their authors saying, this is what it was like. This is the fine feel of the cloth of people's feelings. So next slide, please. When did history begin? One of the things I track in my book, I think I used the word historiography once throughout its pages, is how history changed. And again, going back to the fact that it's really non-academics who produce history, the first great historians, the one at least who come down to us, were Herodotus, who's a sea captain from a kind of outskirts of fashionable Greece, and Thucydides, a disgraced army commander. When they wrote, there were chronicles, there were annals, but people who, like Herodotus and Thucydides, really tried to give their own judgments on the past. This was a totally new thing. Now, history isn't a necessary development, but certain discoveries are requisite if you are to develop as a society, and a sense of the past is one of them. Now, Leopold von Ranke, and in my book, I give, for all the major historians, I was allowed over 100 black and white illustrations in the text, as well as 16 pages of color. I've tried to give a picture of the great historians, both when they were young, or at least in their prime, and then in their maturity, because so often you read a book and you get a picture of a person only once in their life. And I wanted to give a sense of, as it were, the roundedness of someone's career. Von Ranke based himself in Berlin, and he looked about him and is born in 1795. So he lived throughout pretty well the whole of the 19th century. And he saw that science, a word newly coined in the 19th century, was the kind of the wonder word. Scientists could get careers, they could get appointments in the universities. And although there'd been professors of history, it wasn't really seen a career. Some professors of history at some of the major universities really didn't publish much. They didn't have particularly a broad interest in history. Well, von Ranke changed all that. He wrote about the importance of primary sources. He invented the whole idea of tutorials, seminars, the PhD system. And slowly, I mean, he called all this, trying to get historians to be accepted, the discipline of history. And he succeeded. Bit by bit, in the end of the 19th century, France, Britain, America started introducing proper professors of history, and history became a subject that you could study at the major universities. And just as you went to Paris for medicine, you went to Berlin for history. PhDs came into America in the 1880s. The first US doctorate, it was John Hopkins. But one of the questions that I ask in my book is whether the profession of history has actually made our understanding of the past any better. And in some ways it has, but there are many, many examples of bad history. Now, one great popular historian, I put him on the spine of my book because I felt he's probably better known than any other historian, better known than Gibbon, better known than Shakespeare, is, new slide, please. The author of this is a proof copy of Winston Churchill's book, The History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Churchill, I mean, he was a functioning journalist and writer throughout his life. He wrote more small words than Voltaire and Gibbon combined. Yet, in a way, now people might read his books as a historical leftover, but he at the time was a huge bestseller, and his volumes on the First World War, and particularly on the Second World War, were utterly believed by most readers. And yet the way he wrote his books, he had a kind of whole collection, a worker's workshop of people who helped him. And just that proof, you can make out the different handwriting of 6 separate hands, all of whom advised him. And although when he was out of office, he got his helpers, including 2 cabinet secretaries, to raid official government sources and take back the minutes of government meetings. And some of his volumes on the Second World War are just these minutes reproduced wholesale without acknowledgement. So he was, I wouldn't say a bad historian, but a very limited historian. And yet, even though he had all these helping hands, in the end, they're very much his books. And one of the people who helped him was asked, is Churchill really the author of all these amazing number of words? Is he a true historian? The helper said, well, you don't ask if a master chef has cut all the carrots or assembled all the ingredients. He's the one who oversees the whole thing, and that's why he is the master chef and why Churchill really is the author. Next slide, please. Again, you get Simon Sharma as an undergraduate, and as he is fairly recently. Simon is, I think, the finest writer of history living today. And a few years back, he gave a lecture in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, I forget which, but anyway, and he said, academic historians are, in a sense, letting the side down. They're too often trained, a la von Ranke, to go to original sources, and they'll quote and quote all the people, all the books they've read, and they forget that their duty is to entertain, to be read. And Herodotus would go to the great festivals in the major cities of Greece, not just Athens, and his readings of his works, his great work, the Histories, or as accurately, similarly entitled, the Inquiries, and he'd have music playing and people singing, and they were really entertainments. It was Herodotus at the London Palladium. And that's true of the great historians throughout history. They've had wonderful narrative gifts, and a lot of modern historians have lost that major criterion. Now, there are a huge number of very good historians writing now. Mary Beard is another one, although it's interesting that both she and Simon Sharma are TV personalities and have required to shape their writings on history to a large popular audience. But I think that Simon Sharma's criticisms of what has happened to history are crucially important. To take one example of how history has continued to evolve from sometimes very much a standing start, I want to take the example of the American Civil War. It's been said by Robert Penn Warren, for those who remember that great writer, that the Civil War was the single great event in our history, maybe said to be American history. And yet, although there were over 1 million casualties, as many dying from dysentery as from actually being killed or maimed on the battlefield, it took well over 100 years for slavery to be seen as the major cause of the war. Overall, I remember reading, this is over 30 years ago, it being reckoned that there were then over 50,000 books written about the American Civil War. And God knows how many it is in now, 30 years, probably over 75,000. But you get a kind of palimpsest of different interpretations of what caused the Civil War. Now, I'm not saying there's only one cause, but it took really up until maybe the 1920s, 1930s, for slavery being seen as a major issue, even though Lincoln's first inaugural in 1861 said it was the only substantial dispute. You've had, I mean, just to look at some of the reasons given, that northern aggressors were brutally invading, that northern progress and southern decadence coming together were the cause of the conflict, that high tariffs setting off an economic war was the main reason, or the clash of industrial and agrarian cultures, or it was fanatics who couldn't be contained, or it was part of the Marxist class struggle, or the North stopping the South from moving westward. And so you've got an extraordinary range of causes, and each in their time held sway. But immediately after the Civil War, it was the South, really, as you know, that won the peace through what they called the lost cause, a phrase invented in 1866 in a book by the editor of a Richmond newspaper. And then an organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy made sure that there were different textbooks giving a history of the war in the North and the South. And they insisted that the South had been hard done by. And then you have really important swayers of opinion, books like Gone with the Wind, films such as Birth of a Nation, which really made people feel that the South were brave, chivalric, hard done by. And you had a range of historians, William Dunning, who taught a range of students and PhD students, so that throughout the States, people whom he'd taught, who believed in the lost cause version of the war, became heads of history departments. Held sway, I'd say, I said the 20s, 30s, probably till about 1945. U.B. Phillips, who was the son of slave owners, a Yale historian, again, was hugely influential. But even as the Dunning School lost its power, you had the Cambridge School, the St. Louis School, the Turnison School, the Nationalist School, the Charles Beard and his wife's school, the Revisionist School, the Southern Agrarians. You really had, a dozen different views saying, no, the real cause of the war was whatever particular version they had. Of course, one of the things about writing a work of history is it's to say that previous historians haven't got the story quite right. You've got the view which is really more mature, more complete, and more satisfying. So that when, next slide, please, that's W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first Black African-American writer to write a version of the war. And he said that people had totally underestimated how slaves, that people who were enslaved, were treated. But when his book came out, and he wrote a number of books, but his major book, shortly after the Civil War, he was dismissed. He wasn't reviewed. Those who did review him said, oh, well, he's an absolute enslaved to a Marxist interpretation of history. We don't have to pay any attention to him. And it was years before he was seen as the great historian of the Civil War. And since him, there have been a whole roster of Black American historians who've written marvelous histories of what the history of American slavery was like, culminating in a man, next slide, please. I won't say culminating because it goes on, but Manning Marable, who was a professor at Columbia here in New York. I got to know him because I was asked to be his editor for his biography of Malcolm X, which is a wonderful biography. It won the Pulitzer for biography and was runner-up for history. Well, Manning, who sadly died literally days before the book was published, during his career set up African-American studies at 5 different American universities and really revolutionized the place that African-Americans would have on campuses throughout America. So in that sense, the development of the American Civil War's versions over time, in some ways, it's a sorry story that it was so slow, but it's now come, I won't say full circle, but we now have a more complete understanding than we've ever had before. Yet even, next slide, this is from a textbook in South Carolina in the 1960s. And I don't know how legible it is, but an old Negro and his wife resting after the day's work, they seem to be very contented. Reads the caption to the bottom right-hand photo. The truth, anything like the full truth of what happened leading up to the Civil War and after, still took that amount of time to get through. And it wasn't then until, I suppose, Ken Burns' wonderful TV series on the Civil War that you got, again, a kind of history that was that much more complete. But even so, one knows that whatever I might say about our now having a complete understanding, you've got a situation now when, from the 1619 Project view of American history to the 1776 Commission, commissioned by Donald Trump, our country, America, because I'm a joint citizen of Britain and America, is actually riven in its understanding of what American history is. And it's extraordinary today that we've got that division on our hands. And yet, we're hardly unusual. Next slide, please. Here are 2 gentlemen not looking very sympathetic. Last November 2021, President Xi of China, there on the left, gave a speech in which he said that history should be rewritten, that Chinese history was going to be as he felt it should be. And that's what's happening now to Chinese history textbooks. Putin, the same month, gave a speech saying Russian history was going to be reevaluated and rewritten for the same criteria, that textbooks, and he owns a huge share of the royalties from a government-sponsored Russian publisher, textbooks are going to be rewritten to show all the heroic past of Russia and of the Soviet Union, and the full truth was going to be excised. So you've got, just in those 2 mammoth countries, let alone America and other countries who are doing the same kind of rewriting, the fact that history is really at a point of crisis. And I know that all you listening have got a real interest in history. But the fact that so many countries feel that myth-making is part of having a national identity, and that telling the truth comes secondary, certainly in the view of their government, is something which is a kind of denial of what history is about and what the great historians are about. And so, without being a tub thumper, I'd say that all of us have got a war on our hands to see that history is properly told. So I'll leave you with that thought, And next slide, please. We'll go back to our family home, the society to which we're all members, and back to you, Margaret. But as I say, that's my message to you all. We've got a battle on our hands.
We do have a battle on our hands, and if you'll lead us into war, that would be helpful. So I will take this as the sort of the beginning of that. I was so intrigued by your book, and I have so many questions, but I wanted to start with one figure that you addressed in the book and didn't address in your talk, which is Ulysses S. Grant, my question here is, so many of us in the audience are involved in memoir writing. And of course, Ulysses S. Grant wrote a number of memoirs. And I'm considering the line between memoir writing and history. Would Churchill's works have ever been thought of as memoirs? And sort of what is that balance between memoir writing and history, if you could unpack that a bit?
Well, people ask me who I like among the great historians, who I think are the greatest historians. And you know, Grant comes, I think, first or an equal first on both counts. He wrote his memoirs while dying from throat cancer, having lost really all his own money in a Ponzi scheme. He never made money out of being president, and then was taken in by a friend of his. People say that Mark Twain wrote his memoirs, but he didn't. Mark Twain advised him, but they were very much Grant's own work. And when people said, well, we don't believe that, you were a working general, where did you learn to write? He said, look, I had to write concise, easy to understand instructions to all the soldiers under my command. They had to be readable, they had to be succinct. I learned to write on the job, and every word in my memoirs are my own. And they are wonderfully, wonderfully written. But of course, they deal with his early life, they deal with his fighting in the war against Mexico, they deal with the Civil War. They don't talk about his two times as president at all. And there are prejudicial accounts. You know, they're memoirs, he puts his own views forward. His most recent biographer says that, you know, looked at now, the memoirs get all kinds of special pleadings across. But he's a memoir writer. He's writing my account. In that sense, well before Churchill, he was taking Churchill's line, this is not history, it's my version of history. And that's one of the points about memoir writing. By calling it a memoir, you're saying this is my personal view. I'm not taking that, again, highly contentious word, a duty to write objective history. This is history as I saw it.
You do mention that several historians, Gregory of Tours, Herodotus, and also Froissart, that they agreed, that they said that they wanted to write about what they wanted to write about. That I'm curious about sort of the selection process for writing history. Isn't there a version of memoir writing in that, purely by the process of selecting what facts to include in your history?
Well, I don't want to go on and on about people being prejudiced. And often people aren't aware of their prejudices, but we all select, and we're all historians. If you come back from a day of work, you might say to your husband, you'll never believe who I met on the pavement today. I ran into Lady Gaga, and she was reading one of the books we spoke about last week. That's your selection of what was memorable in your day, and how you tell that story is of your own choosing. So, you know, just telling people about your day, your week, or whatever, you're acting the part of a historian. And when I say historian, I've mentioned dramatists, I can mention architects, painters, all the artists who deal in their ideas about the past are selecting and choosing according to their wishes. And I mean, you sometimes will be very conscious of twisting things. When Voltaire wrote his diatribes against the Catholic Church, against Christianity in general, it was because he believed that the Christian Church had warped the telling of history. He said the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And he went out of his way to annoy the clergy who had a down on him from his very first book.
I enjoyed your discussion of the experience of history through other artistic mediums. You go on at length about the brilliant work that Ken Burns has done. His casting of Sam Waterston as Lincoln and Jason Robards as Grant, Morgan Freeman, Garrison Keillor, Studs Terkel, George Plimpton. You know, he got a whole cast of folks involved in telling the story, great voices of letters and memoirs. But long before him, you also discussed the Bayeux Tapestry. And of course, you discussed Shakespeare's Richard III and all of his history plays. There are so many ways of consuming history. And going back to the Bayeux Tapestry, you know, all the same principles apply of selection and of bias. Tell a little bit about that tapestry. I enjoyed that chapter a lot.
Well, it was commissioned by a Norman, Bishop Odo, who's a bit of a villain in his own day, but we'll pass on by over that. But the greatest tapestry workers at that time were in Kent, in southeast England. And they were a whole lot of nuns in a convent there. And they set out both to satisfy and please their Norman rulers, but also to weave a propaganda anti-Norman account throughout the tapestry for those who had eyes to see. And I recount in my book how they managed to do both. That it's at one level, you know, aren't we brilliant Normans? Look how we took over from the terrible Anglo-Saxons. And this is how we bravely conquered England. But if you look more carefully, it's Harold and his men who are the heroes. And the Normans are evil invaders. And, you know, those who write history, it's often said that history is told by the victors. But in actual fact, while you could find many examples that would justify that argument, you'd find just as many that go the other way. Herodotus, as I said, was a bit of an outcast. Thucydides lived in exile after he'd been found to be a failure as a general. Clarendon, who wrote the history of the English Civil War, wrote his account in exile. Accounts throughout every period of history, there will be major accounts written by the vanquished, not the victors.
Yes, you do bring up Anne Frank and Solzhenitsyn and all these folks whose histories they were vanquished or vanished or exiled are sort of the living truth today, particularly someone like Anne Frank.
So, sorry to cut across you. Solzhenitsyn was asked, well, his view was under Stalin, but it would go for Putin as well. How long would it take for the truth to come out? And he said, the truth will always come out. It just will take, and may, in Russia's case, take a very long time.
Turning now to this wonderful collection of questions, going back to some of the ones that were sent in earlier. The question has come up is, what do you think makes a bestseller? And of course, Machiavelli was the biggest seller in Europe in his day, you mentioned in the book. You know, are history sellers now, or as our questioner writes in, what does make for a bestseller, and is history in this category these days?
I spent over a quarter of a century in book publishing, commissioning and editing works of history. I was lucky enough to be John Keegan's editor, for instance, who transformed military history. And very early on, I was told there are four kinds of books: good books, which really sell, bestseller, if you like to use that word, and good books, which don't sell, and bad books, which really sell, and bad books, which don't sell. the good books that sell, that become bestsellers, I reckon there's always a large slice of luck. And I reckon that when they became taken up, and I mean, we know the obvious business of radio or television or films and so on, which hugely helps, probably much more now, probably than good reviews, probably not as much as word of mouth. They've got to be challenging at a time when books that are normally bestsellers are reassuring. Encyclopedias or reference works reassure. Major thriller writers, major romances reassure. But if you get someone like Salman Rushdie, who writes very challenging books, at a certain time, maybe it's because of the awful business of him being under a fatwa or whatever it might be, suddenly the challenging book becomes the book that everybody wants. I remember years ago, in the 70s, a man called Fritz Schumacher wrote a book called Small is Beautiful at just the time that ecological concerns were becoming popular. And Small is Beautiful, he was economic advisor to the Coal Board, hardly the springboard for writing a bestseller. But it was just that moment when challenging ideas on a particular subject was what everyone wanted to hear about.
A similar question related. Is history more interested in sinners or in saints?
Well, it's a big question. If you look at, say, the novels of Charles Dickens, it's his villains who are always much more interesting than his good characters. I don't think he'd ever call them saints, but getting on that way. And the same is true of Dante. The Inferno is much more readable than the Paradiso, or Milton. People use, I think it's Samuel Johnson said Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, because the devil outshines, has better lines than God or any of the saints. And you may admire goodness, and you may want to emulate a good person, but the reason why I think that history, the most readable history, is about what you might call sinners. There's a remark by the German poet Schiller, and he says that artists can be divided into two, strugglers and the naive. And he said naive artists, he didn't call them saints, so people who see life clearly and have no trouble with their beliefs. People like Bach or Bruckner produce, their artistic production is of one kind, whereas a Beethoven or a Mahler really had to struggle to produce their music. And I think one is interested in people who struggle, maybe because we all struggle, except for the very, very few saints, as it were. Now, people who can reach sanctity through struggle, and they're very interesting too. But it's the strugglers in life, with all their faults and all their, to use the Christian term, sins, who really enthrall us. We love reading about heroes, but heroes who struggle even better.
So true. We've had a number of questions come up about historical novelists. Here's one. Please comment on the usefulness, destructiveness of historical novelists, given that even real historians also make narrative choices of content and perspective. If you could lend a little more insight into narrative and historical fiction.
Why do we like stories so much? Going back to Samuel Johnson, he said, it's because they fulfill us. And going back to Simon Sharma, he wants historians, whether they're professional historians or other writers of history, to borrow the clothes of the novelists and to become wonderful narrative givers, to tell good stories. To whatever extent they select things which are only factual, they've got to be able to take the novelist's skills if they're going to tell good history. Now, the word destructiveness with the phrase historical novelists is a bit begging the question. Of course, historical novelists who can choose what novels they want, what facts, historical facts they want to employ, which to leave alone, what they want to make up, that's their right. All they've got to do is, in as much that they set their story in a particular period, it's got to be credible. Coleridge talked about the willing suspension of disbelief in reading poetry. It's even more important when reading historical novel. You've got to believe that whether it's Hilary Mantel or Rose Tremaine, or going back into history, Tolstoy, or the great French realist Balzac, and so on, you've got to believe in the world that they create. Now, that may be destructive in that it may lead some readers astray, but just as you shouldn't believe any novel you read that the facts in it are true, I'm not sure you should believe any historian either.
The question has come up of what are you working on next?
A historical novel. I've finished
Really?
a historical novel. I hope it'll be out next year. It's set in poor northeast France in 1946. So, you know, I didn't think it's autobiographical at all. I had to really read up on the times, read fiction of the time, the novels that Georges Simenon was writing during the Second World War and after, and other great French writers. But it's a historical novel. Whether it's going to be destructive of history, I'll leave it to readers and critics to say.
Many have asked whether it is easier for historians to research now than it was in the past. Are we getting any better at writing history? Computers are making pooling of information possible. Is that good or is that bad? Where do we stand with history today and technology?
Well, technology has made an enormous difference. I mean, for a start, I did a huge amount of reading for my book, but I could access papers, I could contact other experts on various periods of history by the press of a button. The internet, in all its glories, has made research much, much better and much easier to do, and much faster. I asked Simon Sharma, who I've known for a number of years, whether that meant that history writing was getting better. And he was very dismissive. He said, look, yeah, we've got this tremendous research tool, and we can, you know, Zoom conversation with someone on the other side of the world. But in the end, it comes down to the fact, the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, as Yeats had it. The imagination and the skill and the intellect of the individual historian. And he said, you know, Fernand Braudel, the wonderful author of the 2-volume work on the history of the Mediterranean, Braudel didn't have the internet. He wrote a lot of those 2 volumes and a prisoner of war camp in Germany. But what was inside of him is finally the crucial factor in the writing of great history. And, you know, we've now got the business of Chat GPT. I thought, well, you know, it seems the great new discovery, the great WhatsApp that we can consult to discover truths that we want to research. So I decided to use it. And I put into the app, well, next slide, if you've got it, please. How do I research my family history? And that's what Chat GPT had to say. We can't spend too much time on it, but it's available to you. Margaret will make it available if you're interested, or you can ask the question yourself. I actually asked the Chat GPT 3 questions. My second question, change please. So, you know, not uninteresting, but fairly basic. But I couldn't resist my third question. Next, please. Well, it couldn't be rude, could it? Now, actually, it's very Moorish. Once you start asking questions, it's difficult to stop. So I said, I put in my wife as a literary agent. I said, what can you tell me about Cathy Robbins? And its answer was 50% totally wrong. He mixed her up with at least one other literary agent. It was very polite, very flattering, but absolutely wrong. So I put in me, again, 50% right, 50% I was American, anyway, absolutely wrong. So beware, quite apart from anything else, beware of any of these research engines, whether it's Wikipedia or GPT or Google. They're still at a relatively early stage in their development. I was meeting a Washington scholar today, and he said, well, that's true, Richard, but technology is advancing so fast that you would have consulted ChatGPT version 3. By next spring, we'll be on version 7. It's changing and improving at that rate. So there you are, 3 questions I asked and their answers, but it's a great help, but also very dangerous.
One last question. First off, I wanted to comment that I've learned recently that 50% of certain Ivy League schools that we know, 50% of the students are graduating with degrees in coding right now, which is really a remarkable statistic. And the question has come up live in the Q&A as to whether, and we'll just direct folks' attention to it, whether you've read this week's New Yorker piece on the study of history ending in US academia because it doesn't lead to a job. So we have all these folks coding now and not studying history. And I was wondering if you had any comment on that. This particular participant has the same question.
Well, it's a huge debate, and to go into it in detail would have you getting very cross because we'd exhaust our time. But it all happened from an essay by the head of the historical, I forget his actual posting, but he's head of the American Historical Association, I think. And we live in a culture now where people are so ready to jump and criticize and to tear down. And he had maybe one paragraph that was questionable in it. And that's led to a very unforgiving debate. And it's taken our eye off the ball. What the ball should be is making history, defending history. 37 states in America no longer have history as part of the core curriculum. And I've quoted about this division running through our understanding of American history and about the dictators in other countries trying to decide what kind of history they'll allow. History needs defending, and good professors of history, as this man I believe to be, also needs defending, not tearing down.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all of these illuminating answers, Richard. And thanks to all of our participants. We got a lot of really fascinating questions, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. There are just too many, and they're all so good. As we do for each author in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Richard to read to us briefly from his book in closing. So over to you, and I think we have a slide as well.
I don't know how many of your listeners have heard of William Hickling Prescott. He is a 19th century figure who in his time was called the greatest historian in America, the American Thucydides. And what's remarkable, once you look at the portrait and have what I'm about to tell you, you may be able to see it, is he was almost completely blind. He wrote 11 books, the most famous being The Conquest of Mexico and The Conquest of Peru. But when he was at Harvard, his father had been at Harvard, his grandfather before him. It was very much a moneyed Boston family. He was leaving the refectory at the university, and there was a kind of great noise going on behind him. and he turned just as somebody threw a crust of bread at him, hitting him in the eye, left eye. He fell down, concussed, and when he woke up, he'd lost vision in his left eye. Within 3 weeks, through a congenital form of rheumatism, he lost 90% of sight in his right eye. So he lived the rest of his life being allowed to read only for 30 minutes a day in 5-minute intervals. So he had young Harvard graduates reading to him this huge amount of material for the books he wrote. He had a stupendous memory. So he's a major, major historian who's almost forgotten now. But I've chosen to give the last word to him. In 1829, in a review of Washington Irving's Conquests of Granada, he considered the question of what a historian should ideally be. And he concluded that such a paragon must be strictly impartial, a lover of truth under all circumstances, and ready to declare it at all hazards. He must be deeply conversant with whatever may bring into relief the character of the people he is depicting, not merely with their laws, constitution, general resources, and all the other more visible parts of the machinery of government, but with the nicer moral and social relations, the informing spirit which gives life to the whole. He wasn't done. He must be conscientious, he went on, in his attention to geography, chronology, etc., and inaccuracy, which has been fatal to more than one good philosophical history. And mixed up with all these drier details, he must display the various powers of a novelist or dramatist, throwing his characters into suitable lights and shades, interests, and diffusing over the whole that finished style without which his work will only become a magazine of materials. He must be, in short, there's no end to what a perfect historian must be and do. It's hardly necessary to add that such a monster never did and never will exist.
Richard, thank you. And but how very sad that is that there's no perfect historian out there among us, and we all get to sort of employ the facts that we want, and which is what we're going to do anyway, biased or unbiased.
Can we go to the final slide just to make people feel at home?
Okay.
The next slide.
Oh, actually,
sorry.
you know what? The next slide is the book.
I'm
I
sorry.
wanted to thank you all for getting us to think, for informing us and also warning us, Richard. And I thank you for your attention to this organization and showing pictures of it. We do want to remind our audience that copies of Making History are available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. For those of us deeply immersed in history and looking broad stroke, this is an excellent source of information. If you'd like a signed edition for yourself, perhaps as a gift for the April holidays, use the code AMINTS22 as you order, and Porter Square Books will mail your book at any speed you want in any direction. And moving toward closing, we at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's author talk. If you're researching a time in history, a person, or a family, you would do well to visit our nonprofit library and education center in person. Visit soon, though, as we're about to close to the public for a massive renovation. Very exciting. Never fear, though, NEHGS members can access our digital archives and databases, 1.4 billion searchable records any time of day or night. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs for family historians. As you can see on the screen, we work with Americans of all backgrounds and ages. Our mission simply is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, there are more author talks ahead. First, I do want to mention an educational program. On Monday, March 20, we're hosting 2 past American inspiration speakers in an educational panel focused on the topic of institutions and institutionalizations, specifically their secret history and how to access records today. We'll hear from NPR journalist, retired Pam Fessler, the author of Carville's Cure, about a leprosy colony outside New Orleans, out in Louisiana, outside New Orleans, and Harvard Kennedy School professor Alex Green, who served as a moderator for our event about Anne Leary's book, The Foundling, which was about an institution for feeble-minded women. They will be joined by our kingpin genealogist, Lindsay Fulton, and moderator, Bill Griffith. Don't miss this eye-opening and we hope helpful discussion for those of you who are doing family research. And in the realm of new books and new to us authors, on March 27, we're looking at the life and impact of the acclaimed African-American poet, Phyllis Wheatley. She was greatly admired in her time by George Washington and many others. Author David Waldstreicher will present this new book about the poet's journey through American slavery and independence. He'll be joined by moderator Lamerchi Frazier, who is herself an artist and a poet and has been working with Boston history, Black history as a curator and educator for many years. Don't miss hearing from both of them. And on April 4, in a special ticketed program, we're featuring two great American filmmakers and directors. Ken Burns will be talking to the Academy Award-winning director Ron Howard about his new large format book, Our America, A Photographic History. Ron Howard has just advised us which photos he wants to talk about, and I looked over them today. It is going to be a really amazing evening. So, but back to tonight, truly winding down. Richard, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for this wonderful program. And thank you to our colleague Kathleen McKenzie for her work behind the scenes. And to the audience out there in Zoom land, thank you. We are grateful to you for tuning in, for your questions, and for your interest in history. We will hope to see you soon again. A good evening to you, rich with thoughts on history and writing. Good night, Richard. Good night to everyone out there.